Good morning. Welcome to Hudson Institute. My name is Michael Sobolik, Senior Fellow here at Hudson, specializing in U.S.-China competition. And we're here today to talk about one of the very things that kicked off Washington's big rethink on China, started 2017, 2018 or so, which is malign influence of the Chinese Communist Party in American universities. The story has been more than about what foreign adversaries are doing to us. There's a more homegrown, darker element to this. It's also about the complicity of American colleges and universities and the role they play in furthering censorship of free speech on behalf of foreign authoritarians. We talk a lot about research security, critical fields like STEM and national security when we talk about national security in colleges, but there's something more fundamental, which is speech, the First Amendment, and it's something that I would argue deserves more attention than it receives when we talk about these considerations. The Chinese Communist Party might be the regime that we spend the most time in Washington talking about when it comes to foreign malign influence, but it is one of several regimes that, as a patchwork, represent a continuing effort from foreign authoritarians who simultaneously fear free speech and seek to control narratives about themselves to leverage their need for higher education here to do that work within our own borders. It's an enormous problem that isn't necessarily due to lack of awareness, because policymakers have been aware of this for a while, as have administrators in college campuses. But we've known about this for nearly a decade, and this problem still remains and remains quite acute. And not to put too fine a point on it, we have been in a situation where US colleges have financial interests in policing American free speech on behalf of foreign dictators. So that is the problem set that we want to get into here. Not just national security, but what it means for the values that we hold so dear in the United States. With that, I want to introduce our single and sole panelist today, who has written a very good book on this subject, which I would commend to all of you here and those of you tuning in online. Sarah McLaughlin is with FIRE. I'm going to see if I can get the abbreviation right. Foundation for, you might have to help me out with FIRE.
Individual Rights and Expression.
Individual, I keep thinking information because I've been working on AI all year this year, but individual rights and expression. I may not remember the name of FIRE, but I've known of FIRE's work in this space for a long time. You guys have been at the forefront of free speech and First Amendment concerns on college campuses for quite a number of years. And I've also been aware of your work on this topic for a while, so it's great to connect. Enjoyed your book a lot. Sarah is the Senior Scholar for Global Expression at FIRE, analyzes the relationship between free expression in the United States and global censorship. The book that we're talking about today, Authoritarians in the Academy, How the Internationalization of Higher Education and Borderless Censorship Threaten Free Speech, just came out recently. It's a good read, recommend it to anyone. Sarah's writing about free speech issues has also been featured in outlets like Foreign Policy, The Guardian, MSNBC, LA Times, among others. With that, let's get into a conversation about the book and this topic, and then we'll chat for a few minutes, and then we'll open it up for audience discussion in a bit here. You have this warning in your book. You say, I fear we are insufficiently cognizant of how authoritarian censorship is embedding itself within higher education and what that means for at-risk individuals in our universities. Unpack that concern as a starting point. What are we missing? Why aren't we taking it seriously enough? And why did it compel you to write a book?
Yeah, so what compelled me to write this was I've been working on campus free speech issues at FIRE for, I just realized, 13 years, so it's been a while. And I've been working with some of the traditional free speech issues on campus that you're probably familiar with because They relate to free speech controversies in the US, race, gender, abortion, guns. You know, the things that people are used to fighting over, people fight over even more on campuses. But over time, I was starting to see that there wasn't just these traditional US controversies that were happening on campus. It was also about foreign political controversies and the way that censorship overseas and the way that land disputes and election issues overseas are actually starting to affect our campuses here. And there's a reason why our campuses are extremely global institutions. But the reason why I think we're not paying enough attention to it or we're not aware enough about it is it's sometimes difficult to get Americans to care about things that they think don't affect them. I disagree. I think those things actually do affect them, but it takes a little bit of convincing for people to see why. And B, I think there's a reason why universities don't want to pay attention to that issue. And it's because it raises really difficult, complicated questions. It's hard to admit that perhaps the Chinese government is censoring students on your campus if you have very close ties with that same government. It becomes really awkward. How do we admit that this is happening? How do we address it? And I think right now the incentives are very much against universities addressing or acknowledging this at all.
Let's actually talk a little bit about that first reason that you gave, how it can be difficult to care about something if it isn't apparent how it impacts you. We will get into a moment how it impacts students, both American students and international students in a moment. But for these institutions of higher education, we were just chatting before we came in here about the financial exposure of a whole host of American universities to foreign funding in the form of international students paying full tuition, essentially. In the event, like we were chatting about not that long ago with something like a Taiwan war scenario, the risk exposure for our college campuses, if we found ourselves at war with the People's Republic of China, what would that impact look like for American higher education?
It would be a massive impact. I mean, so the most difficult issue to address would be the satellite campuses, the joint institutes that universities have been pursuing in China. So what do you do with these brick and mortar institutions that you are partnering with the Chinese university, which is directly tied to the Chinese government? What do you do with these institutions? I don't see how you would possibly maintain them. Then there's a lot of study abroad programs, a lot of academic programs that universities operate that aren't quite as heavily involved as satellite campuses, but still have a lot of play between the US and China. And then obviously there's the question of international students from China. There are hundreds of thousands of students from China here in the US. They provide a lot of funding. I can get into this more later, but universities are extremely protective of access to those students. Obviously, if there's a situation where there's some military conflict, I don't see how universities would be able to maintain that. So as China gets more and more aggressive about its claims over Taiwan, I think right now would probably be a very good time. I think 5 years ago would have been a good time for universities to figure out what they're going to do if they can no longer maintain these ties in the forms of students or partnerships. But now is probably a very good time because they may have to figure this out sooner or later. And personally, I would not want to be figuring this out after I already needed to have known what the game plan was going to be.
Interesting. So one of the big takeaways I have just listening to your answer now, the intersection of higher ed free speech actually hits geopolitics in ways that maybe we don't fully appreciate enough.
Oh, absolutely. I think it was in the Chronicle of Higher Education. There was a piece maybe a year or two ago that posed the question, do universities need a foreign policy? And I think to a certain extent, maybe they do because they are global institutions. They need to figure out how they're going to address and acknowledge political events happening around the world. And to this point, I don't really think they can. With Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for example, there were not a lot of programs that universities had to move away from, maybe a few study abroad things, but the Russian government has already been so opposed to American higher ed that they didn't really have too many ties they needed to worry about cutting. But there is going to be a point where the countries that universities have been closely aligned with, they're going to do things that universities are going to have to respond to eventually.
Let's talk about the censorship itself and the form it takes. Another warning or maybe cautionary note that you share in your book, when you talk about speech suppression, you say, quote, it does not always bear the traditional and blunt signs we may expect. Unpack that for us. What does that look like on our college campuses?
Yeah, so it does sometimes look like the blunt examples we would expect. So that's what we're talking about when we discuss transnational repression. So things like threats of harm to students. I've spoken to students who have had their families in China brought in for questioning because of what they've done here in the US. So that's a pretty powerful way to manipulate students overseas, to say the people you love are going to suffer because of what you've done. So that's one way. But there's also been, the more quiet, more subtle things. We've seen Chinese consulates in the US attempt to involve themselves in campus censorship to try to directly influence or sometimes warn universities not to hold certain events or host certain speakers, because if they do, they might ruin the friendship between that university and the Chinese government, and no one wants that, do they? And then there's also been, and to me this is kind of the most disturbing thing, the way that students have become involved in this to a certain extent. We've seen student groups, primarily Chinese Students and Scholar Association chapters, start to pick up the mantle of censorship advocacy at some campuses and try to lobby university administrators to use campus policies against speakers that carry messages that the Chinese government doesn't like. We've seen this at Brandeis, Chicago. To me, the most interesting and sort of on-the-nose example was at a Canadian university. The CSSA chapter there attempted to use the university's hate speech policy against students who had invited a Uyghur speaker to come talk about human rights violations in China. And so it's an interesting subversion of university policies to try to use them in a bad faith way to censor people who are talking about human rights abuses.
One of the examples you have in your book that was quite striking, it was, in this case, it wasn't an American university, it was a university, I think, in Dublin. And it was at the time during after like the Russian invasion of Ukraine around 2022. And you have this vignette where you talk about the leadership at the university was hesitant initially to come out in condemnation because they were afraid if they were going to say something critical of Russia, they would then have to be held to account to say something critical about China, and they had a significant body of international students from China. Have you seen something that visceral or that kind of I would say shameless, like in the United States as well? Like how are universities in their sensitivity towards this stuff?
So I think there hasn't necessarily been anything that's shameless that's been put on the record, but there's definitely been a mismatch, I think, between university values and how they operate in other countries. So you will have universities open campuses in countries like the UAE or in China, and there are laws on the books in those countries that are extremely opposed to university values of openness, truth, inclusion, things like that. And so it's very difficult to maintain those values in countries that essentially criminalize them. And I think the response from universities has been to just explicitly ignore this and make no recognition of it whatsoever. And so sometimes I think the shamelessness comes from not what universities say, but what they just don't say, and refusing to acknowledge what's happening and how their values don't align with other countries' laws.
Those laws, whatever authoritarian country we're talking about, and it will certainly to some degree differ in different countries, but broadly speaking, what is it about the authoritarian system, the authoritarian approach to government, that makes many of these regimes so fearful of free speech?
Yeah, well, I think speech has the ability to cut down power without using violence, without Speech is, sorry, I'm going to get into my free speech mode here, but free speech is kind of the antithesis of violence, right? It's the way to change society without having to pick up a gun or a knife. And so I think that's what makes free speech so fearful to authoritarians. It's a way to cut them down. That's not a direct challenge. If you pick up a gun against your government, probably they could do something about it. But if you just use words, it's a little bit difficult to justify acting against that. And I think what we're seeing, in recent decades is that nations that are, wanting to censor your own citizens is a tale as old as time. That's nothing new. But we have a lot of technology and a lot of means now that they can broaden that censorship outside of their own countries. And that's what we're seeing here. Hundreds of years ago, it was quite a lot harder for someone in one country to censor someone hundreds or thousands of miles away. Now it's a lot easier. You can do it in seconds over the internet. And so that's the challenge now. We have technology and the globalization and openness of the world has brought us so many wonderful things, but it's also made it a lot easier for authoritarians to export that and to use these technologies to punish and silence people anywhere and everywhere.
You mentioned one organization in particular a few minutes ago that I want to get into a little bit because I think it's illustrative of a number of different things. You mentioned China Student Scholars Associations. I would venture to guess that for anyone who has some passing familiarity with this general topic, they've probably heard of a Confucius Institute. It's gotten a ton of press. And there's a whole other patchwork of different, like in particular, Chinese organizations that will liaison with American counterparts for exchanges or whatever. But CSSAs, China Student Scholars Associations, many of the examples in your book, and you just mentioned one a few minutes ago, many of these examples with CSSAs were, to me, the most striking and also the most concerning. Not only because of their direct impact on students, but because of their connection to the government, sometimes in ways that were not always clear. Can you say a little more about those institutions?
Yeah, so the CSSAs, there's nothing inherently wrong with a student group that brings people together over shared background, values, things like that. That's what every student group is, essentially. But the problem is that CSSAs have been using their position as student groups to try to dictate what happens on their campus and what their peers can hear. And that's kind of the key thing. If you don't like a speaker, if you don't like what someone's coming to say on a campus, you have a lot of options. You can protest, you can ignore it. There are a lot of things you can do, write an op-ed. But what you shouldn't be doing is trying to make sure that your peers can't hear that. And that's what's been happening with the CSSA chapter. To me, one of the most disturbing CSSA incidents happened nearby at George Washington University. And what happened there was before the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics, some students had posted flyers from a Chinese-Australian artist. They were criticizing human rights abuses in China and implying that it was not the right place to hold the games. And so CSSA and another student group complained to the university. They suggested that this was really hurtful and harmful to students on the campus to have these flyers posted. And so the university not only said we'll take them down, but the president at the time said, I'm personally offended and I'm going to use university resources to find out who posted these. And so this to me is kind of that shocking free speech crisis that people need to be aware of. The idea that an American university would be using its security forces to figure out who criticized the Chinese government, that is shocking. So it's not just a student group saying I don't like the speech, but also effectively lobbying the university to punish the people who had posted them. And fortunately, GW, a lot of people, myself included, were very critical of this incident, and GW reversed course. But I think there was a lot of students who left that experience thinking that they were not free to speak and they were not free to criticized the Chinese government on an American campus here in Washington, D.C. There was something similar at the University of Chicago. Nathan Law, who was an exiled Hong Kong democracy lawmaker, he was invited to speak at UChicago at a speaker series. And the CSSA chapter there wrote a letter to the university demanding his disinvitation, saying that they were going to tell other Chinese students not to come to the university if this is the kind of speech that was invited there, that it was hurtful and offensive. And they also suggested that it was not even protected by the First Amendment, which is not correct.
Wow.
To put it mildly.
That's there is. I recall the GW stuff as that was happening. It's been a while since I've thought back to the specifics of it, but I mean, just that instance of UChicago, like the fact that they would even say something as ridiculous as that this is not First Amendment protected speech, gets to, I think, something that strikes me about, your book is more than China, but China comes up a lot in your book. And it gets to me something that is so central to the Chinese Communist Party in particular, that it's not just enough to control narratives about the party inside of China. They are on a quest to have discourse power and discourse control globally. Mm-hmm. And the authoritarian wellspring that comes from, on the one hand, it's really impressive that they have the capability and the infrastructure to do that. I also find it really unimpressive that they feel the need to do that at all. And I think that makes the complicity of these universities that much more striking. And that's a theme you get into that I want to ask you about now, that it's not just bad regimes doing bad things in our soil, it's universities oftentimes greasing the skids for this kind of stuff. Have you picked up on any sort of self-reflection or self-awareness, which probably wouldn't be public in many cases, but did you have conversations with any administrators when you were writing this and get the sense from like behind the curtain how they're thinking about this?
There is, at least publicly, very little willingness to address or acknowledge what's happening here. And I think, I touched on this a little bit earlier. The reason why is if you talk about this happening, then you have to explain why it's still appropriate for you to have a joint institute in China. It's really awkward to have to say, yes, my business partner is trying to punish and silence students who are paying me $80,000 a year in tuition. So it's awkward. The one university that I'm aware of that has directly addressed this is Purdue University. There was a really fantastic ProPublica investigation a few years ago into a student's experience at Purdue. He was an international student from China. He started to become very vocal about attending Tiananmen memorials, about his religion, about Christianity. And because of that, his peers were starting to harass him, threaten him. They told him they were going to report him to security forces in China because he was violating the law with what he was saying. And Mitch Daniels, who was president at the time, he issued a good statement. He said, this is not something that's acceptable at our campus. We're not going to allow you to threaten or harass your peers just because they talked about the Tiananmen massacre. But that stood out because it's so rare. For the most part, we're not seeing acknowledgement of this. And as we were discussing earlier, eventually we're going to have to, I think. I'm not sure how long this charade can continue where we don't address the elephant in the room to a certain extent. But right now, it's not something that's going to be publicly discussed, I don't think.
So for someone who's either listening now or for someone who is maybe becoming more aware of this problem on our campuses, I could imagine how it would be easy for them to think, this isn't good, but I don't know how this matters. And with that line of logic being, as Americans, we should always want free speech. We should always want the ability for free expression for anyone who is within our borders here, because this is what makes us who we are. But if there are cases of foreign governments doing bad things, we may not like it, but what does it mean for Americans who have graduated from college many, many years ago? Maybe they don't have children on these campuses anymore. or maybe they do, but they think I raised my kid well, they know how to like discern and figure out these things for themselves. What does this dynamic, if left unaddressed, how does it negatively impact not just our campuses, but like us? And what does it do for free speech here?
Sure, so there's a few different ways. One, if you have people on a campus down the road who feel like they can't speak freely for a reason as disturbing as that, a foreign government wants to punish or censor them, those are, number one, things that you are not able to hear. So, free speech is also about what you can hear and not just what you can say. And so if other people are silenced, that limits what you can hear and what you can learn. And also just more broadly, higher education is really important. The reason why so many authoritarians want to silence higher ed is because it really does matter. It's the home of a lot of political debate, but it's also where important research takes place. And so the way that all of us understand the world we live in, to some extent relies on what happens in higher education. So you may think it doesn't affect you very much, but what you know of the world around you actually matters a lot in relation to what can be said in higher ed. But also, more broadly to Americans who think, all right, this doesn't matter to me, the question of authoritarians abroad essentially dictating what can happen, maybe it doesn't affect you on a campus, but it will affect you elsewhere. To me, a really interesting example is Midjourney AI, which is an image generating platform. They're most famous for the Balenciaga Pope image, if anyone remembers that.
Oh, I do remember that, actually. Yeah.
But they actually have a policy that you can satirize anyone, but not Xi Jinping. And so that is a rule from a US-based company applied to US users. And it's not because they had to set that rule, but they eventually, when they created that rule, wanted access to China's market. And so rather than trying to create different policies for users based on where they were, they made that the global rule. And so it actually does matter a lot what foreign countries try to do when they censor, if it ends up perhaps setting the standards in tech moderation. And I think that's a big risk we need to be aware of. And sure, maybe you don't care about what happens on campus, but you should care a lot about this issue more broadly, about governments trying to throw their weight around to everyone around the world.
I did not know about that particular that internal regulation.
Yeah.
That is really interesting. Okay.
There are ways to get around it if you're creative enough. And
with
obviously
like
a
how
lot
you
of people,
prompt it or something?
when they learned about it, immediately decided to try to find
Nice.
ways to get around it. But I think there were many Winnie the Pooh images that were created
Strong.
that day. But yeah, it's, and most people aren't going to go create a satirized image of Xi Jinping, so they probably wouldn't have known about it. But yeah, it would threaten to boot you out of the platform if you tried to generate those images.
Wow, that's amazing. Before we get into more specific questions about how to respond practically, maybe let's just briefly talk about how to respond to this conceptually. Because when I think about the United States from like a political values perspective, we are a nation where we clearly have our creed in a declaration in our Constitution, but we are also a nation that balances different values that are at tension with each other often. Like we talk about liberty and equality, independence and unity, freedom and virtue. And that's just a small handful of like all these things that we all value and prize. But these things can oftentimes live uncomfortably next to each other in politics. When you think about this question of free speech being imperiled in our college campuses because of foreign dictators, how are we to think about, as Americans, how we respond to that? Because I could see how it would be easy on the one hand for commercial interests, as has been happening, to turn a blind eye, and it could also maybe be enticing to go too hard and too fast, and in the process of national security concerns, have some unintended effects that would be bad for individual people and maybe even for speech. So how do you think about conceptually, how should we be thinking about this as Americans when we think about what should we do now?
Yeah, so to me, the broad takeaway is that we need to find ways to respond to this. But the most important thing is that we do not sacrifice our own freedom in an attempt to stop incursions on it from overseas. I think that's a challenge in a lot of different venues, but we need to figure out ways to respond to authoritarianism without becoming more authoritarian ourselves, because at a certain point, I'm not sure what we gain if that's what we're losing. I think it's kind of a Pyrrhic victory to a certain extent. So that is the biggest takeaway for me. And there have been a lot of efforts to respond to this that I think do risk taking away freedoms or making the U.S. look like a less free place to address that. There have been some really bombastic statements about how we need to ban all foreign students and we can't let anyone in, and that is not the right way, I think. I think what we should want is to maintain the U.S. status as this place that is a free and welcoming place for dissent. And so cutting off people who want to come here to speak freely, I don't think is nearly the right solution at all. And so we need to figure out ways to respond that do not create more censorship and more punishment against people that simply want to speak their mind, and that's all.
This is an interesting dynamic too, because if you look at the difference from President Trump in his first term to his current term, I don't believe he was the one who said this during his first term, but one of his senior advisors at one point reportedly floated cutting off all Chinese students to the United States, and that was not done, and I think that would have been a mistake.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then in this current term, he's talked about doubling the number of international students from China to the United States without any corresponding reforms to go with it. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. I view both of those extremes as missing where we need to go. I think that if we were to completely take away or revoke every single visa for every single student from China, that would be muddying the waters, because the Chinese people aren't the problem, the Chinese Communist Party is the problem. And just like during the Cold War, we want these people to see what freedom looks like, as messy as it is. I think that's probably a good thing for us and hopefully for them. But we also need to hold our universities to a higher standard than we are now. And my personal concern is I don't see that middle ground approach from the administration on the question of China and universities right now. I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so to me, unless there are specific and real national security concerns about specific students, which may exist, but outside of that, I don't think that trying to turn up or down the valve of students is the way to address this. I think there are responsibilities that universities need to be abiding by. They have certain legal responsibilities that they need to be following. And so to me, I don't like the idea of making this the student problem when I think there's more responsibility on the university side. Have they been appropriately reporting foreign funding? We know they haven't. So we need to actually be enforcing that, make sure they are properly reporting these things. And also, at public universities, they have First Amendment obligations. And so if we've had public universities that have been acting inappropriately to censor, perhaps on behalf of a foreign power, that's definitely something we need to respond to. And so I think, instead of trying to punish students who I think most of us would agree are largely not responsible for what's happening here, we need to be looking at universities and making sure they have the policies and procedures, A, that they legally need to be following, and B, that are making sure students can have the freest experience possible and aren't able to censor their peers either.
Let's talk about universities on that great point. Near the end of your book, you talk about how universities, quote, must engage in a radical change of their understanding of their role in the world today. And you go on to say, they have operated as if they can reap the rewards of international engagement while remaining immune from the pressures and compromises other global industries face. That could be said of so many different facets of the United States in regards, again, my world is China, so that is like a microcosm of all of our problems right now. But you just mentioned that there are actually obligations, legal obligations for these universities that if they were to take seriously, maybe that duality or myopic approach to things would dissipate or be ameliorated. You mentioned reporting of foreign gifts as one obligation, which you're right, that has been woefully, compliance has been woefully
Yeah,
bad.
to the tune of billions of dollars.
Yes, yes. What are other legal obligations that universities have that if they were to take more seriously would maybe get at fixing this better?
Yeah, so they do have First Amendment obligations. So if you are enforcing policies that in any way violate the First Amendment, you may have a lawsuit on your hands. That's something I know about fire. But if you are using an unconstitutional policy, and that's what it would be if a public university is employing policies that do not abide by First Amendment standards, that's unconstitutional because they are effectively government actors. So if you are employing a policy to perhaps be used to censor student dissidents, or that's open for abuse by students to demand censorship of others, that's something you need to reform immediately. And there have been some states that have been pushing for legislation to make sure public universities in their states are abiding by their legal obligation. But that's the risk. And not to get on my free speech horse again, but if anyone that works in free speech will tell you, you need to make sure you are crafting policies carefully, because once you open the door to censorship, it can be used in a way that perhaps you weren't expecting, but that's the reality of these kinds of policies. So if you do have a policy that doesn't abide by the First Amendment, that does allow for censorship of hurtful or offensive speech, perhaps you're going to get to a point where people are saying that Uyghur speakers talking about human rights abuses in China are hurtful and offensive. So you need to make sure that you actually have policies that aren't open to that kind of abuse and actually abide by the law.
And I guess another thing too, and this circles back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago about why this is not just a university problem, but it is a problem for all of America. You see this exact dynamic at play in different parts of our culture. You have in your book the whole anecdote of what happened in 2019 with the NBA, and how it was, I think, the general manager of the Houston Rockets who had this innocuous tweet about fighting for freedom and standing with Hong Kong. And then the whole league came crushing down on him because of their China exposure. And it wasn't necessarily, I guess, a legal obligation in that case, but it was a commercial interest that had this outcome where it was decidedly un-American with how that was handled.
Yeah, and I think we do have to admit up front that the NBA was punished a lot for that 7-word tweet.
They were.
I mean, they lost hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue over this. And so I do think, it's important to be upfront. There is sometimes a really serious cost to having values. But if you have values and then abandon them when they become difficult or expensive, they weren't values. They were just slogans that looked good on paper and that you abandon when the time comes. And so, I think the NBA, that was a really shameful time, but it was also really useful because I think it helped show people that there are these kind of corporate interests, and that industries that we might not be paying attention to as much are going to be making these kinds of compromises in ways that we are never even aware of. But then we got to see very clearly on blast what those compromises look like. And as we said, the reason why it was so, shocking was because the NBA is very activist. It is very social justice forward. And so to be picking and choosing when you have values, those aren't really values.
Yep. Let's talk about the government now. So universities have their obligation, but policymakers also have their obligation to pass good laws and then to enforce them. So how, in your judgment, how has Congress and the executive branch over the past number of years been on those two counts?
We've had some good movement, like we've had some attempts to enforce foreign funds reporting. I think that, really ramped up during the first Trump administration, dropped off during Biden. It's going to be ramping up again, I expect. But it's been too patchwork, I think. A lot of it has been state-driven. We were especially talking about Confucius Institutes earlier.
Yeah.
And there have been a lot of state laws addressing Confucius Institutes, some better than others. Some make me pretty wary when it gets closer to perhaps even censorship on the university side. So that's one thing that legislators need to be really careful about, but it's been patchwork, and I don't think that there has been much consideration of how to fully address this issue. And I do worry that right now we're going to be in a difficult place for reform, or that at least universities do not have much incentive. Because right now, as I'm sure you all know, there are a lot of federal funding threats to higher ed. And so I think universities are not going to be in a position right now where they're remotely willing to alienate funding sources from abroad. If anything, I think they're going to be looking more abroad. We're seeing that with Saudi Arabia right now. A couple of universities are going to be opening campuses in Riyadh. I expect to see more of that. So I think the more disruption we have when it comes to funding here, the less incentive universities have to try to address that overseas.
You mentioned a few minutes ago on the subject of how elected officials think about and respond to these, that there have been maybe a few swing and misses where it either hasn't worked well or it has sacrificed our own values of free speech in the process. What have been some of those instances that maybe the heart was in the right place, or I don't know, maybe it wasn't, but attempts to fix this that actually either made the problem worse or created new problems? Like what are cautionary tales that you would advise?
To me, what was especially disturbing, there was an executive order, I want to say it was last year or 2 years ago, from Greg Abbott in Texas. And this was meant to, I think the phrasing was, harden the state of Texas against CCP interference. But I think what it did was create kind of disturbing new risks of surveillance and censorship. There was a rule that faculty members at Texas universities, if they were traveling to China, they needed to start creating a dossier of what they did there. So like if you're going to China as a faculty member to visit family, you need to have a list of, today I visited the grocery store with my mother, then we went out to dinner for birthday. And that to me is disturbing. We don't want to create, if our fear is that the Chinese government is surveilling and censoring people, which it is, we probably don't want to tell academics here that we want to surveil them without cause. So that to me was a big swing and miss. And also just more broadly, as we discussed earlier, just the reliance on banning students without evidence of anything, I think that's very inappropriate. And again, we're punishing people who are already being punished.
Before we turn it over to audience Q&A, I want to ask you, which, I don't know, I am easily cynical when I look at these problems because we've known about this for so long, and we are, it's not for lack of effort that we are still talking about this problem set, because there are plenty of folks either in your space in advocacy and education or in policy making that are aware of this and are trying to get at this. What would you say, if looking at where we are now, the likelihood of something changing either within academia or within Washington in the next few years that you see a real noticeable pivot in a better direction?
I'm trying to find reasons for optimism. I'm not sure we have much to look forward to on that front. I'm sorry, I'm going to try to come up with something. But I think right now, as I mentioned earlier, there are not many incentives for universities to try to address this for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
And I think as the relationship between higher education and the federal government gets more adversarial, I don't think universities will be particularly looking to the federal government for assistance with reform.
Sure.
Okay, a little bit of positivity. Something we noticed at FIRE was actually in recent years before, for example, the Trump administration was trying to get universities to sign some agreement that they would abide by some reforms, some of which were not appropriate. we actually were seeing universities start to move towards more open and permissive free speech policies on their own,
Yeah.
based on advocacy we and others have been doing for decades. And so I do think it's possible for universities to move towards some kind of reform, but it needs to be done in a way that I think they need to be convinced it's good for them. Because we've seen a lot of alumni groups, for example, lobby their universities to have better speech policies. And so, it's if you can show universities that it's good for them to be doing this, I think we'll see perhaps some movement in that direction. But we need to do a better job of making sure they see why it's good.
And so I guess the reason I asked that question, and I was honestly kind of expecting the answer you gave, like that was exactly what I was expecting, is like we started this conversation talking about how this is not just an insular problem within our borders, but this is part of a global reality of geopolitics too. And I mean, the nature of America's relationship, not just to China, but even to Russia and a lot of different authoritarian regimes, they're changing, but they're changing in different ways for different countries, to be sure. But with China, our relationship with Beijing looks nothing like it did before the pandemic. And even so, this is one of a whole host of areas where we are exposed to foreign malign influence, where there's awareness, but there just is not actual qualitative change or reform to go along with that awareness. And I guess throughout this whole conversation, I've had that your response about Taiwan in the back of my mind, because if it would take a crisis to really jigger a fundamental shift, that is an unfortunate commentary on the state of our political system, where we're free, but it takes a whole lot to mobilize us as free people who we disagree on a lot in America, as it should be. And the First Amendment protects that freedom, but it also means that we're not centrally planned, which is good. But there are trade-offs to everything, and one of them is it takes us a long time historically to be mobilized, to have systemic change. But I will also say, as a final editorial note on my end before we open this up, this is why I think the work that you guys do at FIRE is really valuable, because if we want to mobilize awareness and affect policy change, I guess, quote unquote, left of launch, like before crisis comes, you do that through our political process in ways that's winsome and based on our shared principles. And that's exactly what you guys have been doing. So I'm encouraged to hear that you guys have had some success along those lines, because gosh, when I was in the Senate, this was the first, maybe after the South China Sea fake islands, this was like the thing that mobilized Capitol Hill on China. And we're still working our way through it. And I guess politics is always a slog. But all that to say, I'm really grateful, not just for the book that you wrote, but also for the work that you guys do, because it's really needed.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's open it up to questions. If we have thoughts from the folks who are here in the room. We have someone with the microphone in the back. Yep, right up here on the aisle.
Hi, Joel Thayer from the Digital Progress Institute. I really appreciate the conversation, and obviously the education space is a complicated space when it comes to free speech, especially when you have private universities versus public universities. But one thing that we noted was the intersection of technology and the use of social media in order to, for lack of a better term, silence folks from abroad. So obviously there was platforms like TikTok, I believe it's WeChat is the other one that a lot of Chinese students use in order to communicate with folks back home. And there was at least some evidence that suggests that the Chinese government was using those platforms to either do some self-censorship on their own, or even outright threaten these folks. So do you see any role from the educational institution to at least be aware of that? Like, what would your response be to someone who comes from China, wants to come to our university, learn, engage in like the free discourse, but is afraid because they may be being monitored by the phone that is the very thing that's allowing them to communicate with their family back home?
That's a great question, and that's actually one of the things that I suggested universities need to address, in a reform capacity, is that they need to, be, telling students what their rights are, just as a basic thing. A lot of American students don't know what their rights are, so we especially need to make sure that people coming from overseas, know the basics of the law here and the rules here. But I think we need to actually be doing some kind of technology training for international students, because we need to, I think the future of speech repression is largely going to be based on internet speech. It's going to be happening online. And so to the best extent that we can, helping students coming from abroad understand the basics of how they can speak freely here, anonymously being the most important thing. Because we actually have seen students who posted on Twitter, for example, while in the US, and then were in prison when they returned home to China. So just giving them the basics of the extent that it's possible to have anonymity on the internet, how to achieve that, what devices they should be using, how they can perhaps separate their personal phone use from academic phone use, just to make sure that they at least know what they're getting into when they use the internet to speak. Because we've had, I think a lot of, I think that's one simple way that universities can at least address this issue that doesn't create, bad incentives for them. I think they can teach students this, and it won't harm the university side. So I think that's at least something they can do for their students.
Any other hands? Yes, right here.
Hi, Thor Mortensen at the Vandenberg Coalition. So you talked about the patchwork between the federal government and state governments. How do you have any ideas about how that could become a more uniform approach between the states and the federal government? And do you have one priority area, whether it's disbanding CSSAs or cleaning up funding of schools, that should be kind of the first thing that's tackled?
So I think the primary things I would want to see tackled would be the funding issue. Make sure that universities are abiding by what's actually required of them, but also making sure that we are having resources for transnational repression. I think we have improved on that in recent years, and I want that to continue to be a resource for students, because I think right now there aren't really many places that international students can turn to if they are facing that kind of repression. So to make sure we are having a very well-publicized, very active transnational repression unit, like in the FBI and other parts of government, just to make sure that people know that if they come to us to report this, we will ensure that they are kept safe, and we will do everything we can to make sure they are free and safe here in the United States. And when it comes to the patchwork issue, it really depends. I think in some ways it will make sense for states to have different policies depending on what kind of academic research or what kind of university systems are in their states. My only, I guess not my only, but my primary concern there would be just to make sure that legislators who are pursuing these kinds of changes make sure that they abide by the First Amendment. Because A, I'm a big fan of the First Amendment, but B, I think we should be crafting laws that aren't going to be overturned, essentially.
Yeah. Other questions? I will just say something that you mentioned offhand in that answer that is just so striking to me. The fact that we haven't invested more resources to counter transnational repression. That is shocking. That is shocking to me. And it's more than just the problem of what's happening on our college campuses. There was the other nationwide incident of these like shadow police stations that like Beijing agents have set up. And it's not just that we need to respect our own national security enough. Like if we have any student on any college campus that is in a position where they're not able to exercise the rights they should be able to, and especially if they're in danger or they're being coerced or threatened, that is just simply unacceptable in America. And it is just insane to me that we haven't devoted more resources to that.
Well, those police stations, that was an extremely disturbing report. But also, if we're concerned that perhaps consular officials are involved in it, we need to be doing something about that. We cannot have consular officials from overseas coming to the United States and attempting to dictate or punish or silence people. That has to be a very clear line.
That's right. That's right. Well, Sarah, this has been a sobering, but I think also a terrific conversation. Your book is wonderful. Would recommend it again to anyone. Authoritarians in the Academy. Pick it up, read it, and follow Sarah's work at FIRE. Other than your website, where can folks follow what you're doing?
I'm on every social media, basically, except for TikTok.
Well done. Phew. Thank you so much for this conversation, and thanks to y'all for coming to Hudson. Appreciate it.